Hello and welcome back. Today I will talk to you about one of my favorite books of all times, Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is one of those books or stories that, no matter how many times I read or see adaptations, I still like it. I don't get bored of it. It is that well made. Charlotte Bronte wrote this novel in 1847 after the rejection of her first novel, The Professor. But this time, Jane Eyre was quite a big success, and it was one of that year's best-selling books. It made Charlotte, who went by the name Currer Bell, very famous. At that time, writing a novel that was controversial to some of the values held firmly in the Victorian society made some of the people at that time questioning and even calling it an immoral book. But today, Jane Eyre is a well-known and familiar name all around the world, and the heroine is loved and respected by many. In this video, I will talk about some of the things that I liked about Jane Eyre. When I first read it, I already knew the story and the main plot points from a very small version that I had read earlier, but I still enjoyed its original version immensely. And I have watched many adaptations and read the book again last year, and I still enjoyed it. So even if you already know the story, trust me, it's still worthwhile reading the book, if for nothing for the beauty of the writing itself. However, I have to warn you that there will be spoilers in this video, so if you don't want to know any, please skip this video. Jane Eyre tells the story of an orphan girl named Jane, who is 10 when we first meet her, living with her cruel aunt, Mrs. Reed, who is not very kind to her. After some accident and the advice of a local apothecary, Jane is sent to a boarding school called Lowood, where she stays for 8 years, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher, after which she takes the job of a governess for a ward of a Mr. Rochester of Thornfield Hall, where she is to experience and feel many emotions that are discussed from Jane's own perspective in the greater part of the story. There are many things that I love about this book. One is the characters. 2 characters that Jane meets early in the book are quite fascinating. One is a student by the name of Helena Burns. This character made me very emotional. She had great faith and she lived by her faith and principles, which is something that I admire a lot in people. The talks Helena and Jane had about forgiveness and self-empowerment by religion touched me deeply. She showed a strength of character that I do not see very often. Jane at first was angry of the way Helena submitted to her unkind teacher, but then, after talking with her and understanding some of the things Helena was saying, she came to admire her, and even more so when Miss Temple, who was the kind teacher and the second amazing person in Lowood, treated Helena as an equal. Jane felt as though these 2 females were way above her in knowledge and strength of character. What I liked about Miss Temple is the diplomatic way she treated the girls at her school. She was a wise person who did what she could for them without disrespecting Mr. Brocklehurst, the most hated master of the school. I hate this man with passion. He represents all the bad things I hate in people. I don't remember if there is a character that I hate more than him, but maybe one of Dickens's characters would come to mind. Helena's death was very well written too, not too dramatic, but I could still feel it deeply. I then also liked that Miss Temple would continue to be a good friend to Jane till she got married, after which Jane felt very lonely at that place and started to look for another occupation. And now to Mr. Rochester, the man that I like a lot, who I hear many disagreements about. Some say he was a bad master for seducing Jane and tricking her into accepting his proposal, and while I agree with this statement, I find myself pitying him. He was thrown at a young age, like he tells Jane one time, into a bad path that he couldn't get himself out of, but the way he behaved in avoiding his problem wasn't the best one. And then Jane comes into his world, and what a contrast she was to the mad wife that he had. A young girl of 18 that was innocent and untainted, with a good set of principles and such a brilliant mind that he found to be equal to his. And this is the most beautiful thing I love about their relationship. that both found the mind to be the best quality of the other, not physical attraction as much as the power of the mind and each other's company. The conversations they had are my favorite part of the book. I can read their dialogues and still marvel at the genius of their talks and the deep meaning they could convey with their words. The first talk they had the day after Mr. Rochester gets back to Thornfield Hall is my favorite. Jane herself is a marvel. She is a fair judge of characters, and she lives her life by her morals and principles, and these are the things that save her from getting into a false marriage to Mr. Rochester. The passage that I really loved Jane and respected her was when she found out about Mr. Rochester's wife. She was broken. She had a heartache that she couldn't endure. She knew she had to go, but this she said would break her, and even more so would break Mr. Rochester, which was the thing she hated the most to do. And yet, with a firmness of purpose of not falling into sin, she defied the voice of her heart and listened to conscience and fled. She ran away from Thornfield and had to spend the night in the wilderness alone. She thought of nature as her mother. This passage made me sad and happy to read. I will read a little of the passage here. Nature seemed to me benign and good. I thought she loved me, outcast as I was, and I, who from man could anticipate only mistrust, rejection, insult, clung to her with filial fondness. Tonight, at least, I would be her guest, as I was her child. My mother would lodge me without money and without price. The first time I read the book, and I was in the passage where Jane met up with her newly discovered cousins, I didn't want her to come back. I thought that she would be better off in that place with her cousins than coming back to Mr. Rochester, because she was doing well on her own and she had an occupation in this beautiful little village that I imagined in my head. Only when I read it for the second time did I realize that no place, no occupation, no friendly company of her cousins would have made her happier than to be with Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester's confession at the end of the book, when he tells Jane that he was glad matters sorted out this way, and that if he was to have her then on a sinful ground, he would have made her miserable, that he loved God for his mercy on him, and that he came to realize and acknowledge God's hand in his life. When he said these things, I loved him more than in all the story. He confesses that he was proud of his strength that is now taken from him, and that he seizes it as a fair judgment from God for doing the things he did and living his life the way he did. It showed how much improved his character has become after meeting Jane and becoming nearer to God. Something else I liked in this book is that Jane, after graduating from Lowood School, began immediately to work for her bread. She had nothing else in the world but her skills. So she worked as a teacher and then as a governess, and even after she ran away, she sought occupation in that village and did not beg for free food, but a work that would enable her to provide bread for herself, and she became a teacher there too. And when she came back to Mr. Rochester, she devoted all her life to him, and she was so glad to do so, not regretting being without work, but doing what she thought was the most important work, that is taking care and living for the person she loved best on earth. She considered herself supremely blessed for being able to do that. And I love to read about these things. People loving each other, living for each other, rather than the individualism that we see sometimes in modern life, that how I matter more than we. In the end, Jane Eyre will remain a classic that is well remembered and loved, that truly shows the genius of Charlotte Bronte. I hope you enjoyed my rather quick and not so in-depth review. Until we meet again.